Make better renders faster. Welcome back to the donut project that keeps on giving. Our sprinkles are done, and now we're going to do some texture painting on our donuts, because if we were to hide our icing here and we just have a look at our donut in rendered view mode, we can see that, yeah, it looks like a donut. It definitely, our brain recognizes it as such, but it looks a little bit fake, a little bit cartoonish. And that is because if you look at real reference photos of donuts, you'll see that they're not one solid color, right? They are, a darkish brown color, but as we mentioned when we talk about sculpting, when it sits in the fat and it's like in the deep fryer and it's floating, the part that is level is getting cooked less. So that part is always a little bit whiter. So it always has this like white ring around the donut. So as always in Blender, there's 100 ways you could do something. I know I've been reading the comments, people say like, oh, why didn't you do it this way? Why didn't you do it this way? Well, yeah, you can do things any number of ways, and we could do like a gradient effect right now, and that would be short and sweet. In fact, that's how I made my original image. I did that with like a simple gradient. But this is an opportunity to learn a valuable part of Blender, which you'll probably want to use in the future for a project, and that is texture painting. So we want to actually paint on our mesh here. So there is a texture paint feature in Blender. So up here, the top, texture paint, right? Now, to on our mesh here. So there is a texture paint feature in Blender. So up here, the top, texture paint, right? Now, to talk about texture painting, you also have to talk about a separate step, which we actually don't need to do for our donut in this case, and that is UV unwrapping. If you go to the UV editor up here, this will show you for your mesh. If you select all your vertices of your mesh, it'll show you your UVs. Now, UVs are, the best way to understand UVs are with this image here of this chocolate. It's like if you have a 3D mesh, in order for paint to be applied to it, you are actually painting onto a 2D image. So the software has to know how is that 2D image going to wrap around a 3D mesh. And that is what UV unwrapping is. Now, the reason I say we don't need to know it for this step is that our mesh is actually already UV unwrapped, because when we added in, we went mesh and we added in torus in part 1, Blender already UV unwrapped it for us. So it's already pretty well good to go. Now, when we do our coffee cup in the next level, when we model our own coffee cup, we're actually going to UV unwrap it ourselves then. But for now, it's already UV unwrapped. The reason I do mention this though is that looking at the squares of our donut here, like if we, this thing drives me up the wall, but the clipping is always way too low. The squares on our donut are obviously like square shapes, whereas over here they are rectangular, which would mean if we were to paint over here, essentially we would get like a stretched image look over there if we were to paint on a square image. However, if we were to start with an image which was rectangular, like stretched like that way, so it was like that, for example, then and don't do this, I'm just to demonstrate, then it would appear right. Okay, so anyways, all this is like a prerequisite to say now we go to texture paint mode. The first thing we need to do is define the size of our image here, and this is where we're going to click new at the top, new image, and this is where we're going to set it up to be a rectangular image. So for the width, I want it to be twice as long as image here, and this is where we're going to click new at the top, new image, and this is where we're going to set it up to be a rectangular image. So for the width, I want it to be twice as long as the height. So you could get out a calculator and type it in. However, there's a little feature in Blender, and that's that you can do math inside any text box. So if I hit *2, that's going to multiply that value by 2. If I hit enter, it's now done the math for us, okay? And then I just need to give this image a name. So I'll call it donut texture tutorial, and then I'm going to hit OK. And now it has created a rectangular image. Okay, now you can see that our donut here is purple and our texture is black, and that's because they're not synced. If it was synced properly, the donut would be black. In fact, anytime you see purple or pink color in Blender, like usually that means, unless you've set it up yourself, but usually that means that it's missing a texture. So purple or pink, think of that as like a warning sign that Blender is looking for something that it can't find. So this is not good. Now the reason it's doing that is because it doesn't have any image that we're painting onto in our material over here. So you'll remember that we set up the base color for our donut right here to just be one single solid color. So what we want to do is we want to swap that out to be an image. So if we went to our shading tab, which you'll remember we went to when we were doing the sprinkles, right here, we want to replace this with an image. So I'm going to add an image node. So go Shift A, and then I'm going to go Input, nope, I'm going to go Texture, Image Texture. Okay, so I add this in, and then what I want to do is take the yellow. This is like a short little tip whenever you're working with nodes. Generally speaking, one color only goes into another color. So this color is obviously going to go into our base color. Then the image texture, we're going to select the texture that we just created, donut texture tutorial. Should be in the dropdown. And there we go. Now if we go back to our texture paint tab, you should see that they would be linked. And if I was to paint over here, just do a quick little across it, you would see that we're now painting on our map over here. And likewise, we can actually paint over on this side as well, and it will paint onto our mesh. And there we go. That's good. Awesome. Now, before we go another step, before we start painting, it's a good idea to actually save our image. Because if we were to save our blend file, which, by the way, good idea to do that. Always get into the habit of doing that. The image actually isn't saved with it. This image right now is stored in kind of like a temporary space. And if you were to quit Blender, you would lose any painting that you've done. So you need to save your image separately to your blend file. So I'm going to go Image, Save As. Separately to your blend file. So I'm going to go Image, done. So you need to save your image separately to your blend file. So I'm going to go Image, Save As. And I will just call this, PNG, whatever, save it, and there we go. So whenever you see a star next to the image, it means, like if I was to do painting here, it means that you haven't saved the image yet. So if you were to quit Blender, you're going to lose any changes you've done. So a quick shortcut is just Shift S whilst your cursor, of course it doesn't work. Oh, maybe it's Alt S, that's it, Alt S. There you go. That's the hotkey for saving the image over here. So you can like quickly do that. Anyways, all right. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give just the base color of my donut. So if I hit the N key, let me make sure that that's turned on so you can see what I'm pressing. N will bring up the panel here, and I'm just going to set a donut color like this. Now there's a fill tool, but it's going to make sure that that's turned on so you can see what I'm pressing. N will bring up the panel here, and I'm just going to set a donut color like this. Now there's a fill tool, but it's going to collide with the white stuff I've already done here. Color like this. Now there's a fill tool, but it's going to collide with the white stuff I've already done here, and I don't know how to turn off the continuous thing. Anyways, I'm just going to paint over the top of it. So let's go strength of 1, and hey, why have I got some so let's go strength of 1, and hey, why have I got some sort of lazy mouse thing turned on? Okay, I've got smooth stroke turned on. I guess that was maybe a hotkey that I pushed. Okay. Okay, I've got smooth stroke turned on. I guess that was maybe a hotkey that I pushed while I was trying to figure out how to save. I guess that was smooth stroke. I'd never seen that before. Anyways. Okay, solid paint over it, okay? Now we want to do that little white ring around it. And gosh, every area of Blender needs to change the clipping. It's so annoying. Anyways, okay, so I'm gonna set the color to white. Now, actually, I want to keep my color, my donut color there. If I hit X, which is the same hotkey as in Photoshop, it'll flip between the two colors in your palette. So that's just handy. So I'm gonna set this one to white. And I want to use a low strength of like 0.3, 0.2, something like that, because we don't want this white to be like blinding. Otherwise, it'll look like it's kind of like, you know, just like painted on there really deliberately. So something subtle, like it's kind of like that. Because we don't want this white to be like blinding. Otherwise, it'll look like it's kind of like, you know, just like painted on there really deliberately. So something subtle. And you'll notice we can paint both in the 2D mode and you can paint also on the 3D model. So it'll update both of them interactively. It'll like sync them together. Now, one thing to note is that if we continue this around here, because we are drawing with a mouse, especially, it's going to be really, really obvious that it's been painted, right? Because it's a continuous stroke. If you've got a stylus, you can use pen pressure and it's like a little bit better. But even regardless of that, it helps to use a texture to throw some extra detail in there that you're gonna miss with just your brush. So you can use a texture mask. You would think you would use texture, by the way, but texture will actually use the color of a texture that you put in there, which isn't what we want. We want to use our original colors here, but we want to add like a stencil effect to it, and that's what texture mask does. I only just learned this myself. So anyway, we're clicking on new texture, and then down here, the very bottom, there's a little texture panel. And then at the top, we want to select from brush, mask, texture. And then from the type, because the default is set to image, you can put any image in there, but we're going to use clouds. So this is a procedurally generated texture that comes with Blender. It's probably the most common type of procedural texture you use a lot, basically. So if we paint now, you'll see that we get a very faint, if I just turn this up just so we can see it, you can see we get a texture painted over it now. And you'll note that actually the more you paint, it sort of covers it up, but it still kind of keeps the same like tile to it. So actually what I like to do is change the mapping to random. And then like every time you press it, it'll be like a new kind of rotation of that. Kind of keeps the same like tile to it. So actually what I like to do is change the mapping to random. And then like every time you press it, it'll be like a new kind of rotation of that brush. And it'll look a little bit, I don't know, it's just more appropriate for what I want it for. All right, let's turn down the strength again and let's just do some painting. Also, we can change the size of the brush as well. Sorry, the size of the cloud so that it's a little bit more, yeah, it's a little more varied. But there we go. Cool. Right, now one thing to note, by the way, this is like at the seam of the texture. So actually, if I was to paint in the 2D space over here, like if I was to paint across there like that, you can see we get a seam. And that's because when you're painting in the 2D space, it won't continue a stroke over to the other side, right? It'll just paste it where you put it. But if you draw on the 3D model, then it will. It'll continue it across that side there. So when you come to like a seam, you just make sure that you are drawing on the 3D space, not the 2D space. Anyway, yeah, we just continue around it. This is the sort of thing that if you do that, you can see we get a seam. And that's because when you're painting in the 2D space, it won't continue a stroke over to the other side, right? It'll just paste it where you put it. But if you draw on the 3D model, then it will. It'll continue it across that side there. So when you come to like a seam, you just make sure that you are drawing on the 3D space, not the 2D space. Anyway, yeah, we just continue around it. This is the sort of thing that could take 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 hours, depending on how detailed you want to go. But most of it's going to be covered up with icing. This is the kind of thing, it's the kind of detail that you'll notice if it's not there. But if it is there, you might not notice it. Do you know what I mean? It's like when you're watching a movie, right? Nobody notices the audio of a movie unless it's bad, unless they've That's the only time anyone notices or talks to an audio engineer is when they've done a terrible job. It's kind of the same thing here. It's like it's something that if it wasn't on the donut, it might look, people will go like, the donut looks fake, and they won't know why. But if it is there, they won't notice it, but they'll just say, looks great. So anyways, that's kind of the look we're going for. Because I've got the original donut texture as that thing, if I hit X, then it's kind of like I'm erasing the white parts, so that can be handy as well. Also, looking at our reference, why not, since we've got the brush out and everything ready, do some painting to the actual dark parts of the donut, because it's not a constant color on the donut itself either. Like might look that way, but the more you do art and the more you do 3D, you'll develop an eye for noticing things. And there's no constant uniform color in the real world, pretty much ever. It just doesn't exist. There's always fluctuations and slight variations, especially for something like this. So yeah, I'm gonna use, I'll use my white brush. I'll set this to black though. And we could paint like this, but that's just gonna be dark. What I wanna do though is set it to overlay, the blend type to overlay. And then it just doesn't exist. There's always fluctuations and slight variations, especially for something like this. So yeah, I'm going to use I'll use my white brush. I'll set this to black though. And we could paint like this, but that's just going to be dark. What I want to do though is set it to overlay, the blend type to overlay. And then what it will do though, and we could paint like this, but that's just going to be dark. What I want to do though is set it to overlay, the blend type to overlay. And then what it will do is it will kind of retain the original color of the donut, but it'll just make it a little bit darker, a little bit hotter, which is kind of what I want. Now, obviously, most of this is going to be covered up with icing. So, you know, don't go overboard spending too long detailing the donut that's not even going to be visible, but a little bit, especially, you know, near the front, near the camera. That's where my camera is, at the front there. Can definitely come in handy. Oh, also, we should probably do some of this around the, also around the base of it as well. We got to do the inside of the donut, so let's just do a little bit around here. As you can tell, I'm doing this very rough. But, you know, it's, yeah, it's like, why not, right? It's the sort of thing, like this is a thing you note when you do CG a lot, is like there are things that you know could improve something, but it's too much work, right? So if I didn't have the texture paint tool already open and ready to go, I probably wouldn't bother going to the trouble of painting on the donut. But since it's here and it's already set up, we might as well add the detail because it's going to help us. Anyways, let's floppity flop this around, and let's just do some white inside the donut here as well. This is really not going to be that visible by the camera, but little bits of it will. And just some, that kind of looks like a bagel. It actually really looks like a bagel, but that's all right. They are quite similar, I guess. All right, so that is going to do it for the texture. That's probably fine as it is. Yeah, just erase some of this that's looking a little too hot, a little too white, but that's good. So make sure you save your image when you are finished. Image save, it's done. And now if we go to layout mode, let's bring back our icing and let's have a look at this. Or actually, you know, turn off the icing. That's probably, yeah. There you go. You should be able to see the texture now painted onto your donut. And if you don't, make sure that your shading, inside your shading settings, you do have the correct image, the same one that you painted on and you saved is going into your base color. And by the way, you probably note that, like, you know, we put this into the base color, but now that you understand it, you could probably understand we can also paint onto the roughness input. We could, just by doing a separate texture paint and putting that into the roughness, or we could paint onto other properties of it. So this is just, you know, base base painting, but you can paint and create a really layered material. That's the kind of thing that substance paint is typically good at, because it can do color and roughness and all those things in the same brush setting, and you can create really interesting things. But anyways, that's going to do it for our texture paint. So go ahead, click here, and in the next part, we're going to be adding displacement and procedural texture to the donut and push the realism even further. So I will see you in that video. This tutorial series is brought to you by Polygon. Make better renders faster. G'day and welcome. This tutorial series is brought to you by Polygon. Make better renders faster. G'day and welcome to another edition of Donuts Will Haunt Your Dreams Soon, because they're haunting mine. Seriously, I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 weeks other than donuts. I'm actually dreaming of donuts. No, that's not a joke. Anyways, we have, in the last video, we painted our donut and it looks more donutty, but not enough. It still looks like something you'd see out of an early Pixar movie because there's no detail to the surface of our donut. If you compare it to reference photos of donuts, you can see you got all this like glistening bits that are sticking out and like bumps and little crevices and dark patches and all that good stuff. And that is the perfect thing, not for painting, but for procedural texturing. So with your donut selected, we're going to go into the shading mode, which is this mode right here. And painting, but for procedural texturing. So with your donut selected, we're going to go into the shading mode, which is this mode right here. And by the way, just in case it's not, it should be look dev mode when you are in shading mode. And by the way, this, I didn't really explain what look dev mode is, but solid view mode is the same mode that you see when you're in like layout mode, like this view. And then look dev mode is actually using the Eevee renderer to preview your material that you've got active with an HDR. So it's using the HDR that's available here, which is basically like a template light and reflections for it. So look dev stands for look development. So it's the perfect shader for, previewing material so that you can work fast without having to set up lights and everything. It's just like, it's there and it's awesome. So when you go into shading mode, it should already be there in look dev mode, but just telling you in case it's not. Anyways, okay, so to put that at the top there, and then here we have our node setup. Okay, so right now all we've got is just that image texture that we painted, and that's going straight into our base color there. So what we want to do is we want to add in a procedural texture. Procedural means it's by computer generated. So to do that, we're going to go Shift A, and then where it's got texture, you can see we've got a whole range of different textures here. Computer generated. So to do that, we're going to go Shift A, and then where it's got texture, you can see we've got a whole range of different textures here. Image texture was the one that we used before. That's obvious. And then the one we're looking for is noise texture. So we add that, and that'll drop this guy in here. And if we want to look at what this is going to look like on our mesh, the best way to do that is to actually use an add-on that comes with Blender. So if you go to Edit, Preferences, and then underneath the add-on section, search for Node Wrangler. And then just check the box next to it, and that will enable it. And then once you've done that, you can Control Shift left click on that node, and it will preview. Once you've done that, you can Control Shift left click on that node, and it will preview it over your model. Right? Let me just hide that stuff. There we go. And there you go. So you can see that's what the texture is. Left click, and then once you've done that, you can Control Shift left click on that node, and it will preview it over your model. Right? Let me just hide that stuff. There we go. And there you go. So you can see that's what the texture is doing. So that's the default like color input, but if you Control Shift click on it again, it'll view the next input down, which is the FAC or factor, and that's black and white. So what we want to do is we want to use this black and white cloud texture to drive the bumpiness of our material as well as the color and contribute to it in that way. And it's a very common way of just adding like free detail to objects. But before we do that, one thing to note looking at the donut here with this texture, the texture is kind of stretched. Like there's more detail across this surface, but less this way. And that's just because the way that this is mapped onto it right now. It's not using UVs or anything like that. But the best way to change that is by adding in a Shift A, vector mapping. No, hang on. Texture coordinate. That's the one. Texture coordinate node. And if we just take the object output and drop that into the vector input, this is now going to use the object data, which is actually most appropriate for like procedural textures. Anyways, now that I've done that, if we increase the scale of this, we should see pretty standard detail everywhere without there being like more or less detail in different places. So that's good. Okay, so looking at this cloudy texture here, yeah, I mean, let's just set this to, I don't know, 300. That looks fine. And let's start by making this affect the bump of our material. So to use bump mapping in Blender, there's two ways of basically contributing to bump. There's bump, which is kind of like fake bump, and then there's bump, which is real bump, and that's actually changing the shape of the actual mesh. And that's the one we want to use for this. So that's called displacements. So I'm going to take this output of this, and I am going to add in Shift A vector, underneath vector displacement. So drop this in here. And then what I want to do is I want to take the factor output of that and put that into the top of the height. And then I want to take that displacement and put that into the bottom of our material output right there. Okay, now by default, it's still looking at this bottom. And then I want to take that displacement and put that into the bottom of our, I want to take that displacement and put that into the bottom of our material output right there. Okay, now by default, it's still looking at this noise texture here, but if we Control Shift click on our just main shader, the principal shader, we should here, but if we Control Shift click on our just main shader, the principal shader, we should now see the effect of that on our mesh. Now, currently we can't because we're actually in look dev mode and it's kind of like not showing us the detail very well. But in rendered view mode, you can see with actual light that has like shadows and everything, you can see the effect that it's having. And again, this clipping thing, it's going to drive me crazy. And my screen keys tool's turned off. Not that it really matters for this part, but anyways. Okay, so that's the kind of bump that it's got over our mesh. And that looks pretty good. It's not bad. But you'll see that it's not changing the, like if you look at the edges of the object aren't changed. So when you're doing it just like this is actually the fake bump way. It would be the same as if you put it into the normal input for those who know what that is. But by default, this is what it's doing. So it's the fake bump. But if we want to make it so that it actually is displacing the shape of our mesh, we want to change right down here, underneath your settings, you want to change the display is going to very well looking to height from of our material output right there. Okay, now by default, it's still looking at this noise texture here, but if we Control Shift click on our just main shader, the principal shader, we should now see the effect of that on our mesh. Now, currently, we should now see the effect of that on our mesh. Now, currently we can't because we're actually in look dev mode and it's kind of like not showing us the detail very well. But in rendered view mode, you can see with actual light that has like shadows and everything, you can see the effect that it's having. And again, this clipping thing, it's going to drive me crazy. And my screen keys tool's turned off. Not that it really matters for this part, but anyways. Okay, so that's the kind of bump that it's got over our mesh. And that looks pretty good. It's not bad, but you'll see that it's not changing the, like if you look at the edges of the object aren't changed. So when you're doing it just like this is actually the fake bump way. It would be the same as if you put it into the normal input for those who know what that is. But by default, this is what it's doing. So it's the fake bump. But if we want to make it so that it actually is displacing the shape of our mesh, we want to change right down here underneath your settings. You want to change the displacement from bump only to displacement and bump. And before I do that, let me just Control Shift and set. We want to change right down here underneath your settings. You want to change the displacement from bump only to displacement and bump. And before I do that, let me just Control Shift and save because I am using a experimental build. Okay, there we go. So when you do that, what it's going to do now is it's actually displacing the donut. And hey, anybody order a porcupine? The reason is it's the scale of it. This is the height of the bump, that value there. Way too high. So we're going to set this to 0.01. And let's see how that looks. There we go. So you can see now, looking at the edge of it, at the edge of the donut, it's actually physically displacing it. You can see that looks a lot more realistic than before. This is with bump only, and then this is with displacement and bump. Now I think scale of 0.01 is still too high. Let's go 0.02 perhaps, or 0.03 perhaps, something like that. That's okay. And by the way, this is using the mesh to displace it. So it will depend, the look of your displacement will depend on the number of vertices that you've got here, the amount of detail. If you don't have enough detail and you want to add more, you can just go to the modifier stack and add in a new subsurf modifier like this. And then you would see like smoother, like less spikes. If you see like lots of spikes, it's generally a sign you've got like not enough vertices for it to play with. So you might want to add a subsurf modifier in there. But anyways, that's not bad. Now, what I actually want is for like really, really small detail. So I'm going to crank this scale up to 1000. No, let's go 150. 15, no, not 15,000. Really, really small detail. So I'm going to crank this scale up to 1000. No, let's go 115. No, not 15,000. 1500. There we go. Something like that. Great. So this was a good little primer to show you what procedural textures can do. But in the next video, because I want to keep these, relatively short, we're going to add in another procedural texture. We're going to combine it, and we're going to make it contribute to the color map as well, and then just basically finish off the donut and finish off level 2. So click here to watch the next part, and I will see you there. This tutorial series is brought to you by Polygon. Make better renders. This tutorial series is brought to you by Polygon. Make better renders faster. G'day, and welcome to the final part of level 2, where we're going to be finishing off our donut. Oh, sad little tear. We've been so many places. It's looking okay. The last part we added in some small scale detail, but now we want to add in some larger scale detail to go with our small detail, and then also make it impact the color map. So first, the large scale detail. Looking at reference, you can see that this is what we're trying to create, right? Like, we've got not just like small little bumps across it, but also larger bumps, like pimples. I don't want to call them pimples, but it's what they kind of look like. So the cool thing is, about working with nodes, and the reason that so many artists love them, is that you can do so much with them. They take a little while to understand. Like at first glance, they're confusing, but once you realize that it's almost like programming. It's like taking this attribute and putting it into that attribute, and it's fun, and it's actually like creative. Like from an artistic perspective, you can do a lot with nodes. So what we can do is we can duplicate this noise texture, take the output of the object input, same one as there, and let's control, take the output. What we can do is we can duplicate this noise texture, take the output. Like creative, like from an artistic perspective, you can do a lot with nodes. So what we can do is we can duplicate this noise texture, take the output of the object input, same one as there. And let's Control-Shift-Click on that. Using Node Wrangler, we can do that. And then I'm going to set the scale to 200, right? And this is going to become our large scale bumps, right? Now, if we were to take the output of this and just put that into the displacement there, you would see that, yes, it's connected to the displacement, but it has overridden this one, right? The small scale one. Let me just... things get a little bit squishy on a screen when you're trying to show two things at once. But yeah, you can only put one in there, right? It just overrides and kicks the other one out. So what we want to do is combine the two of these. So because these are black and white values, this is actually very easy to do. So what we're going to do is add in a mix RGB node. So if we go, this is Shift A. Oh man, always turns off. There we go. Shift A and then go to a mix RGB node. So if we go, this is Shift A. Oh man, always turns off. There we go. Shift A and then go to color, mix RGB, and we're going to drop this in right here. And we're going to make sure we take in the factor input of both of them, not the color. It wants to use the color, but don't let it. The factor input of both, and I'm going to put them in like so. Now, if we Control-Shift-Click on the mix shader, this is what the mix is outputting right now. If the factor amount here is set to 0, it's going to be using 100% of the top input, which in this case is the small detail. If it's set to 1, it's going to be using 100% of the bottom input. And that's not good because we actually want both of them, but doing a blend isn't also the answer. Those of you that know, image software though, knows that you can change a blend type and it can be more than just like one or the other. So if you set this to add, what it's going to do is it's going to take the bright values from this texture and then apply it over the top of the values on the other texture. So that should be exactly what we want. And if we turn the factor all the way up to 1, then it should have that kind of look. So the small detail and then the larger detail sort of punching through it. So I'm going to control kind of exactly what we the bright values from this texture and then apply it over the top of the values on the other, then it should have that kind of look. So the small detail and then the larger detail sort of punching through it. So I'm going to control look. So the small detail and then the larger detail sort of punching through it. Control-Shift. Anyways, guys. Egyptian tomb for 2,000 years. But anyways, now in together this texture and then apply it over the top of the values on the other texture. So that should be exactly what we want. And if we turn the factor all the way up to 1, then it should have that kind of look. So the small detail and then the larger detail sort of punching through it. So I'm going to control click on that shader there, and that's the look that we have right now. Now this isn't, it's maybe better, but it's still looking quite fake, right? It just looks like you've got more detail, but it's all just kind of like mashed in together. And what we want is like very clear, like lumps, like whoop, 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 like big bumps. So if we look at the factor input, we can kind of see why this is happening, because we haven't just got the white values, we've also got all different shades and things in between it. Well, if you remember, like when we worked with the color ramp node before with sprinkles, that can change, it can transform a value. A color ramp node it's beautiful. We use it a lot, especially for things like this. So if we go Shift A, converter, color ramp, and if we drop this between our large scale detail and our add node, then let's just Control Shift click on it. So we can just see what it's looking at. If I only want to have those white values, and I don't want to have too much of the other stuff, if I bring in this black slider there, then we'll get exactly that. We'll only get the top values. And then, if assuming that this is, oh gosh, what's it actually doing now? Okay, it does get it looks a little confusing, but I'll show you the final node setup at the end so you can copy it. But anyways, now if we have a look at the add node, this is what we should be looking at. So now you can see there's a clear division. We've got the small detail and the larger detail. And now let's have a look at the final shader. And you can see it looks a little bit cleaner, right? Now you can turn, if you feel that the small detail is a little too high, which I think it is, let's turn that down to a scale of about 0.02. Or the other thing you can do, like the bottom input is the one which is always controlled by this. The top input is always at 100%. So if you actually want, in this case, we want the large scale detail to be the one which is furthest out. So I think it actually makes sense to put the large scale detail in the top input and then actually use the slider to decide how much of the small detail to let through. And now I think that actually has a better control, because we can actually have that kind of lumpy look and then bring in as much small detail as we want. So this is like basically putting like an opacity on the small detail of like 70%. And that's kind of cool. I might actually turn that up to 2000 for the small detail. And I think that's pretty good. Not too shabby. By the way, I hope you can't hear it, but somebody is vacuuming. It's a Sunday. I come in here to do some work before I go off on my trip. So I have to work on Sundays. And then the cleaners are here, of course. But anyways, the bumps are good. And I'm actually, I'm quite happy with this. I've tried like 50 different variations of how to make this donut, like the bump parts, how to make it look good. And I think this is one of the best. So yay, I'm glad it's worked for the tutorial. But it's right now it's only influencing the bump, and that would kind of be a waste, because most things in the real world, like if it's affecting the bump of this, it's also going to affect the color of it. Like if we look at the reference photo, you can see that wherever there is a bump, it's generally darker than the stuff underneath it. And I believe it's because it's like, it's further out, and therefore it's got like more surface area, and therefore it's going to be hitting more new oil, and therefore it's going to be like it's going to be cooked more than the stuff that's underneath it. That's my understanding of it. But anyways, so yeah, we could take the value of this. Actually, let's move this shader over so it's a little easier to understand. So this is the data that's contributing to the bumpness of it. So what we want to do is we want to drive this into the base color. But just like before when we were using the single input, it'll only take one input, and we don't want it to look like a donut that was left in an Egyptian tomb for 2,000 years or something. I don't know. We wanted to, we want to influence our texture map, right? So we're going to do that in the exact same way. So we're going to use a Shift A mix RGB color node. So I'm going to drop this in right here. And what I want to do is I want to take the output of this and I want to put this into the factor input. Okay, so let's just move this along. I'm trying to get it all in the screen, but I also want you to be able to see the details of what I'm doing here. So this add is going into the factor input. Now the factor input, normally there's a slider there, right, which will control the opacity. But if you replace that and put something into the factor input, that's going to make it act like a mask. So it's going to make it use the black and white values of this to decide which parts of color 1 and which parts of color 2 to use, these inputs. So the reason I'm doing it like that is that I can now make this, and you can see that this bottom value here is now becoming the values that are sticking out. So if I was to set this to a dark value like this, you can see that it's the exact effect that I want. But even better, and this is why I've done it specifically this way, I can change this to overlay. And now it's actually affecting it. It's not just like a blanket, like, opaque, like painting on top of something else. It's also being tweaked by the values underneath it. So it's like saturating it, and it's essentially making it look like it's burnt, which is the look that we want. Ta-da! And there we have our lovely, crispy looking donut. If it looks a little too saturated, you could maybe dial it back, maybe make it look a little bit darker if you wanted to. You could tweak these values forever. Anyways, that is the finished node setup. If you want to copy my values, feel free. I would encourage you, though, to mix it up. And if you think you've got a better idea, go for it. Like, learning and like venturing out and like stepping away from the tutorial path will really help you learn some of these and sort of solidify the methods in your brain, if that makes sense. And it'll help you learn a lot better. So definitely get creative and venture away from this, but I do want to show that. Anyways, guys, that is it. We finished the donut. Yay! So this was obviously the first 2 levels, just focusing on the donut. Level 3, we are going to do a coffee mug, a glass coffee mug with coffee in it, and that's going to involve transparency, volumetrics, texturing, UV unwrapping. And then level 4, we're going to put both the donut, the coffee, we're going to add a brick wall, a counter table, as well as do like a little finished animation as well. So we're halfway through it, guys. I hope you will continue the series. Just because I know some people might be wondering why theirs doesn't look like mine, or like how can they improve it. I'll just quickly mention a couple of things that you can do to improve your donut. I think the big one is the sprinkles. Like the size of your sprinkles and the number of sprinkles can really make a difference. So experiment with that. Definitely experiment with it. And the distribution. The distribution of your sprinkles and like the size of them. I think a big ball, that might help it look kind of cool. Something else I realized after we did the weight painting was when you're in weight paint mode, I realized it's probably very unusual that you would have a uniform exact distribution of sprinkles all around. That might help it look kind of cool. Something else I realized after we did the weight painting was when you're in weight paint mode, I realize it's probably very unusual that you would have a uniform, exact distribution of sprinkles all around the donut. It's kind of silly. So instead, I would suggest just like doing a couple of holes in it, right? Or areas where you would have less sprinkles than other parts, right? Because if you're sprinkling it with your hand, you're definitely going to get parts where there's going to be like way more sprinkles than others. So I feel like any variation and randomness you can add, the better. So that's something that you can do. There we go. Looks a little bit more random, a little bit more interesting. And then the other thing is, of course, the material for the icing. Play with this. Like, I'm actually still not sure exactly what the correct value should be. I've gone through several iterations of it. I'm not sure if it should be like a stronger subsurface scattering, let more light through it, or less. So definitely play with it, play with the color schemes. That's definitely going to help you. And then also, if you find that when you did the texture painting, if at the end of it you realize that you've got like too much of the white is coming through, like if you've overdid the white painting, which is something that I did for the first few times I made the donut myself, a really quick fix, if you don't want to have to redo the painting, is right in between here. If you just add in a mix RGB node like this, and then you set the bottom value to just a blank, like uniform donut value, like, that's original value that we had, right? That orangey kind of yellow value. Then this value here will decide like 0 is going to be 100% your original texture painting. And then any of this will kind of be like adding a solid color overlay in Photoshop. It's kind of like just adding that over the top of it. So you can like completely overpower your original texture painting if you want, or like a value in between it. But I happen to think mine looks okay. So that's the value that I am going to go with. And just for something completely silly to end on, because you made it to the end, guys. You made it to the end of level 2. Well, not the end. You've still got 2 more levels to go, but just something fun. And in the spirit of the old series, let's make this icing radioactive. So there is an emission value, in the material for our icing here. Icing selected. That's the one. Yep. So I can go emission, and if I turn that up to white, that's now going to be glowing white. And then I can make this any weird color that I wanted to. I can make it radioactive green, like was it Homer? He was eating a donut that was radioactive green, wasn't he? Something like that. Something completely silly to end on. But thank you, guys. I hope you will enjoy the next series. If you're watching this like live as I upload them, like to date, there's going to be a 2-week break because I'm going to Japan and Korea for a business and family trip. So there's going to be a 2-week break, and then when I come back, you will be able to continue the journey of level 3 and level 4. But otherwise, click here when the video is available, and I will see you in the next video. Bye. G'day.